Anyway, so we have a daunting task today to talk about two very important and also fairly complicated philosophers who were actually friends in life. David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. David Hume is a wonderful philosopher. Okay, while people are getting their stuff together, let me tell you a story. One of Hume's biographers says that if he was invited to a philosopher's party and every philosopher was present, and he could sit next to anybody, he could sit next to Hume. So last night before I fell asleep, I was thinking, who would I sit next to? I think Hume is a very good choice. Definitely, at least my second choice. My first choice would probably be Epicurus. Sextus is pretty good, but I doubt if there would be much to talk with Sextus. Foucault is a bit daunting. But then when I woke up in the morning, so I guess my first choice is Epicurus, second is Hume. But actually, when I woke up in the morning, I realized, well, actually, if it's really a philosopher's party and every philosopher is present, then I'm going to sit next to my man, the Buddha. I'm afraid you can't top that. Anyway, sorry, that's just digressions. So, but I do love Hume. I do love Hume dearly. And I think, without a doubt, he's at least by general consensus, the most important philosopher to ever write in the English language. That's a very tall order, but there's a very broad, very strong consensus about that. Unfortunately, we will not be talking about Hume next year in great detail, which means that this year we will leave a lot of issues necessarily sort of hanging in the air. Many subtler points of Hume's philosophy we will not really explicate. So, in a large respect, we need to look at Hume in relation to other philosophers. So, we're interested in Hume for his critique of Locke, for his prefiguring anticipation of Kant's metaphysics, of Kant's epistemology, and of Kant's moral philosophy. Hume is extremely important for Kant. And also, very importantly, of John Stuart Mill. Hume and the utilitarian tradition have an interesting relationship. Was Hume a utilitarian? That's a complicated point. It's a technical point, the kind of point that we will not be able to pursue, but maybe I'll say one word about that. Short answer is, to oversimplify, yes, but in details, no. So the answer to the question, was Hume a utilitarian? If this word means anything to you. By the way, Boucher and Kelly, when they talk about roles, they talk about roles within the utilitarian tradition. So we had this discussion with group number 8 last time. It seems that roles is, broadly speaking, within the utilitarian tradition. So it's not Kantian deontologist, although, is anybody writing about roles? Probably not, or whatever. Okay, well, so let's make a note of this. At some point, before the year runs out, let's maybe figure out where roles is standing. Okay, anyway, so as usual, we don't have a lot of time, and I don't want to spend time on any introductions. Again, David Hume, well, let me just say at least one word. So David Hume is one of the key members of the Enlightenment movement, more specifically of the Scottish branch of the Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment. And he was a friend and an older contemporary, an older friend of Adam Smith. And Adam Smith actually liked, I should even say loved Hume dearly as a friend. Hume is the first philosopher in this course, for our purposes, who is a complete and thorough atheist. Some people will tell you otherwise, don't believe them. It's not true. I mean, there's a very famous dialogue which was recorded by Hume's biographer on Hume's deathbed, where Hume said, his biographer asked him, David, do you think that maybe you will survive death? And Hume replies, well, it's thinkable that if you put a coal on a piece of fire, it will not burn. But actually, I'm not counting on that. And Hume was dying of stomach cancer in great pain, a little bit like Epicurus. But he was completely cheerful on the deathbed. And he had this reputation as a secular, as an atheist saint, a person of perfect life, very, very nice, very benevolent, very cheerful, right until the very end. Again, not believing in God, not believing in immortality of the soul, dying of a horrible disease and horrible pain, but still being completely cheerful and friendly with everyone. With one exception I don't want to go into. Maybe not exactly an exception, because I don't know. This is by his biographer. Maybe his biographer is stretching things. Anyway, so Hume did not like enthusiasts. I'll have a chance. let me make a note. I need to talk about enthusiasm at some point. This word has a technical meaning which you probably do not understand yet, so it doesn't matter. So what do we begin with Hume? Well, again, Hume, if you want to see Hume in the context of this class, we have already met Hume in Sextus Empiricus and in Epicurus. And Hume, to a large extent, is a combination of the two, which is, again, a very good reason for us to have talked about both of these guys. By the way, as far as I know, Hume did not have kind words for Sextus because he hasn't actually read Sextus, as far as I understand. But the tradition is there. It's alive in David Hume. And likewise Epicurus. So you combine the two. So basically combine hedonism with skepticism, at least in certain ways. So this would be one way to get into this. But properly speaking, if you want to begin, we have to begin with methodology. Methodologically, Hume, first and foremost, is an empiricist. He says that, again, following in the footsteps of John Locke, not political philosophy of John Locke, but metaphysical epistemology of John Locke, Hume is going to say that all of human knowledge is derived from experience. Now, why does he say that? Again, you can go back to the old skeptical arguments of Sextus Empiricus. The only thing that is left at the end of the day, is left standing at the end of the day, after all the skeptical arguments have been folded out, is the appearances. And again, the skeptics have this negative phrase, we don't believe anything because there's no reason to believe anything, but we acquiesce before the appearances. We give up in the face of the appearances. Appearances force themselves onto us. Like again, when I open my eyes and I look at this marker, no matter how hard I try, I see a black marker. I can try as hard as I can to maybe see a Sherman Firefly or a Sturmgewehr, but I see a black marker, or lamentably. It's not up to me, okay? The appearances force themselves onto me. And again, if we had more classes, we'd talk about this more. But Hume's arguments are taken very seriously up until this day, and at least in the negative sense, nobody has been able to convince the philosophical community that any other solid basis for human knowledge is possible. Although experience is not a solid basis; it's a fleeting basis. Also, let me just insert 1 second of lament, and that we are not talking about Descartes in this class. It's a grave omission, but we only have 14 classes, and somebody had to go. So Descartes is gone. But Descartes, as an important European skeptic, also walks around this point of your subjective experience as the only solid guide to reality. Anyway, so let me talk a little bit about Hume's epistemology. So this is not going to be directly related to his political philosophy. Why am I talking about this? Well, first of all, this will set us up for Immanuel Kant next time, because Kant will have important ideas about how human knowledge works on the one hand, and on the other hand, you see, epistemology is actually relevant to politics, especially this question: how do we know things? And we have seen some of it already in previous classes. But actually, as you continue your studies, please do not do this. As you continue your studies, especially in the third year, you will talk about the tradition of social constructivism, social construction of reality. How actually human beings do not have direct access to reality, but reality is partially constructed by our minds. We will see this idea today in David Hume. And this idea will be important in your international political theory in the third year. That again, things, especially political realities, do not exist in a vacuum by themselves. Or at least we do not have, this is a more careful way of phrasing it. We do not have access to the things the way they really are. That in fact, again, human beings in an important sense construct, or if you want, imagine reality. The simplest way of putting this is this: that perception, in a large part, is imagination. Perception is, in a large part, imagination. And again, this has political consequences. See, if you describe certain things in a certain way, this affects reality. If you describe a certain event as a just war, righteous war, good war, we're supposed to support it. If you re-describe it as genocide, you're supposed to not support it. And again, descriptions, the way you imagine things to be, matters. Okay, so I gave you the thesis. I haven't given the justification. So let's go and see the justification. So David Hume is occupied with many issues, and we need to talk about them. So starting with causation, but also very importantly, the idea of the self. Who are we? Then we need to talk at some point about the notion of God and some others. Let's start with causation. So again, this is not political philosophy, but this will have repercussions for political philosophy down the line. So I have this marker, and I let it go, and it falls. The question is, what do we see? What do we see in this event? My letting go of the marker is followed by the marker falling down. So I see A followed by B. And Hume says, if you're going to be an empiricist, you have to say, this is the only thing that happens. I see two events. Now, most people, or at least most philosophers, most scientists, at least on the first glance, would seem to disagree. No, Alex, it's not just that you let go of the marker and it falls. The marker has to fall. So between my letting go of the marker and the marker falling, there needs to be a necessary connection. A necessary connection. So, which is to say that when I let go of the marker, it has to fall. It must fall. And here, where Hume's skepticism comes in. Hume asks this question. Well, why? Why do you think that the marker has to fall? All I see is event A followed by event B. If I flip the switch and the lights come on and come off, what do I see? Do I see the necessary connection between the switch and the lights? You know, to make this a little bit of a stupid example, but let's imagine as I flip the switch and as the lights flicker, actually the switch, that I imagine there's a switch, okay? And as I flip the switch, actually there's somebody on the other side. This switch is actually not connected to anything, but there's somebody on the other side of the room who secretly, hearing the clicks, pulls the real switch. How do I know? All I see is I flip the switch and the lights come on and come off. All I see is a sequence of events. Can I imply the cause from the sequence of events? Some people tell me, well, let's suppose you make a perfect experiment and you isolate all the variables. If you think about this for 5 seconds, it's impossible to do, because how do we know what are all the variables that you need to isolate? I can take some kind of measuring device and make sure that there are no secret electric currents. Okay, I have measured electromagnetic field, but maybe there are some other ways of making light work. Up until the year 2011, or maybe 2009, people did not know, or at least for sure, that the Higgs field existed. Maybe the Higgs field is affecting the light switch. So by contemporary account of modern physics, there are at least 17 quantum fields. One of them is Higgs field. Maybe there's more. Maybe there's 18 or 23 or 666. Who knows? How can you control for things that you do not know? The unknown unknowns, if you want. So let me go back to this example. Hume says that if you think about this very carefully, you will find that in my letting go of the marker and it falling, you never see the necessary connection. You do not see it. But your mind jumps to conclusion that there is a necessary connection. The only thing that you see, is, Hume says, is a constant conjunction of resembling instances. Let me not write this on the board. Let me write a simpler word. The only thing you see is correlation. You see correlation, you never see causation. Where do we get the idea of causation from? We imagine it. We get it from our imagination. So the mind is not merely passive, but the mind is also active. The mind imagines things. So again, as I'm letting go of the marker, I have this anticipation. My mind imagines that the marker will fall. And actually what I experience is not the vindication of my rational hypothesis. No, what I get is a satisfaction of an irrational part of my soul. My mind anticipated, in some sense, if you want to oversimplify, wanted the marker to fall. And as the marker is falling, I have this feeling, I have this pleasant feeling. Yeah. It's like an itch, and I scratch it, and it feels good. But it's not true. It feels good, but it's not true. I imagine the cause. No, what is not true? What is not true? Not true is that I do not see the necessary connection. maybe there is a necessary connection, because you, again, remember, skeptics always talk in the negative. Maybe, who knows? There is a necessary connection. But it is unavailable to the human mind. The human mind cannot perceive it. The human mind cannot grasp it. We imagine these things. This has been taken by modern science too hard. Any scientist, I told you that most people don't think, yeah, true. But good scientists, any scientist worth their money, any scientific textbook worth its money, will tell you that science is not about causation. It is only about correlation. Again, at the time when Hume was writing this law, F is equal to m1 multiplied by m2 divided by r squared multiplied by g, famous Newton's law. Where is the necessity? I mean, it is a description of the way planets move in the sky. By the way, not a very accurate description. We know that this formula is false, but with the bad telescopes people had at the day, it seemed true. So according to contemporary science, you need to add a plus sign. And according to Hume, for all we know, you might need to add a million other plus signs. Or maybe this whole formula is wrong and this will stop working tomorrow. Who knows? But still, this formula is a description. It is not an explanation. It is a description. It is not an explanation. It is a description of a regularity which obtained in the past. But there is no deep reason for the human mind, perceivable to the human mind. There is no deep reason perceivable to the human mind of why this formula has to be true in the future. Why do we believe it then? And Hume, again, as a skeptic, he cannot know this apodictically. He cannot give a geometric proof of this. But he says, as a matter of experience, when you observe the mind, you see that the mind is, in a very important sense, driven by passions. And again, passions, again, the word passion has the same root as the word passive. Passion is something that happens to you. You don't choose your passions. In some sense, again, as Locke would say, through internal perception, you observe that inside of your own head, you have these emotions which you do not create and do not choose. So if you're thirsty, you haven't chosen to be thirsty. Okay, it's something that your body does to you, to your consciousness. And so again, so these passions, in one sense internal, but in one sense external, like internally external to you, in the sense that you do not choose and do not control them. Say hi to Buddha, by the way. Anatalakkhana Sutra. Let me go back to Hume. Anyway, so these passions lead us to jump to conclusions. And basically Hume says that the only, so I have water in this flask. How do I know, says David Hume, that when I drink it, it will nourish me and not poison me? And Hume says, strictly speaking, I do not have any rational reason to believe that whatsoever. But I have an irrational desire to believe it. So in some sense, the fact of our irrationality, you remember, I began the course with Martin Heidegger and the fact of our own death. I meant that seriously. Because this is partly a reflection of what Hume was going to say. We, human beings, are driven creatures, driven and anxious. And we don't have a lot of time on our hands. And we are afraid of spending time in idle reflection. So the clock is ticking. We have to make conclusions. With imperfect evidence, we make conclusions which are not warranted. We make them because we are irrational, because we, mortal, maybe, or some other reason. Like, I cannot afford to sit there all day and deliberate. Will this water poison me or not? I have this desire of thirst, and this passion irrationally will take control of my mind and make me drink it. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, says David Hume. Now, one last thing I want to say about this. This is maybe slightly more technical. Some of you could say, but look, Alex, I know that the water will not poison me because I have experience. I have observations from the past. I have maybe 1,000 or maybe 1,000,000 observations from the past. Doesn't this count? And Hume says no, because the only way that your past experiences can be used to predict the future. So the only way that you can use the past to infer what's going to happen in the future is if you assume that the past will resemble the future. If this is not clear, maybe let's go over this in the seminar. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but let me repeat this one last time. So again, only if you assume that the future will resemble the past can you use evidence from the past to predict the future. But here's the key question. What is your ground for assuming that the future will resemble the past? Well, if it's your experience in the past, then this argument is circular. You are saying in the past, future resemble the past, therefore in the future, like, let me try to say this clearly. Like, the fact that pasts predicted past's futures has bearing on future only if you assume that future will resemble the past. But this is exactly what you're trying to prove. This argument is circular. Maybe this is unclear. Let me say this just differently. Human beings empirically do not, again, we have these formulas, but we do not know the reasons for these formulas. Maybe all of these formulas will change in the next moment. Maybe, yeah, there's some kind of Higgs field squared, I don't know, Higgs, second Higgs field that's going to make water poisonous in the next millisecond. For reasons I don't know. For reasons I do not anticipate. So again, we observe certain regularity in the past, but we observe no reason why this regularity has to persist into the future. The fact that something used to happen in the past over and over and over again is absolutely no guarantee that it will continue in the future. Okay, if this is unclear, don't worry too much. Maybe we'll talk about this more in the seminar. So, let me also briefly. I need to get to moral and political philosophy, but before I do, let me mention two other things. And one when we talk about God, obviously this has huge implications for political philosophy. So this is going to be almost our first step into that. But let me talk about the self. Hume also has this very interesting critique of the self, which again is similar to some of the ancient traditions, very similar to the Buddhist tradition. Again, there's this question, has Hume read Sextus Empiricus? Hard to say. Has Hume read the Buddhist sutras? It's possible, but we have no evidence. But it's thinkable. But for the sake of the argument, I'm going to imagine that Hume arrives at this on his own. So the idea is that Hume says that, strictly speaking, if you close your eyes and you look inside of yourself, so you close your eyes and look inside. You do this characteristic philosophical thing. You turn your eyes inward, right? What do you see? And Hume says, you see a bunch of things. You see a bundle of impressions. This, that. But what you do not see is a self. A permanent, unchanging self. Again, so maybe a feeling of headache, certain desires, certain memories. But all of these things, again, strictly speaking, are not you. Now, Hume, again, remember, skeptical arguments are always negative. Hume is not saying that he can prove that the self or the immortal soul does not exist. He is not saying that. But he says that if you actually pay attention to your experience, you will find that there's absolutely no empirical reason to believe that you are the same person you were 1 moment ago. Okay, you maybe have a memory of being the same person, but a memory is something like an internal impression. It's not a guarantee. And in contemporary science, contemporary neurophysiologists are very interested in this argument. Because, yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, if you look at the mind, theoretically, all of your it doesn't actually happen as far as I know biologically, but it could happen that all of your neurons and all of your molecules change in the brain, but for some reason we still think that you are the same person. It's a complicated argument, and it has many implications, who knows which. Nietzsche, I'm not sure he read Hume, but Nietzsche will make a use of a similar argument down the line. But let me just leave this hanging in the air. It's an interesting idea. What are the implications exactly? That's a more complicated point. Let me finally get to moral and political philosophy and start doing so by talking about God. Hume, well, again, you got to understand, arguments against the existence of God. What's that thing? I mean, can you really prove a negative? Strictly speaking, no. So, like, a negative statement in principle cannot be proven. But so these arguments always have to be conditional, or maybe like in need of qualification. And Hume attacks all sorts of arguments for the existence of God. One argument that he attacks is the famous Aristotelian argument from first cause. If causation is out the window, then the argument from first cause is also out the window. The technical point, if you didn't understand that, don't worry too much. The second bit of Hume's attack, now this is much more important. And this is important politically because we've seen this argument. We have seen this argument in John Locke. There's the famous design argument. The world appears to be far too orderly to be a product of random chance. Therefore, John Locke assumes that by the natural light of reason, every human being alive on planet Earth should be able to prove the existence of God to themselves beyond reasonable doubt. Hume is going to say this is an incredibly weak argument. Because if you actually open your eyes and look at the world, the first thing you see is misery, suffering, death, starvation, animals being torn apart by parasites from within, the predators tearing prey to shreds. Human beings, think of all the natural and man-made disasters. Think of famines, earthquakes, tsunamis, but also wars, sieges, famines, plagues, the list goes on. I mean, Hume says, if there really is a designer, it's very clear that this designer is limited, either in his capacity or in his benevolence. We've seen this argument before. It goes back to the Epicureans and the skeptics. But again, this is a very important argument. And many people think that maybe this is the most powerful argument against the existence of God. Can it be answered? Well, there are some people who attempt answers. But again, you see, if this was a theology course, we'd spend time talking about this. Well, this person says this, and Karl Barth says this, and Immanuel Kant says this. But you see, at the end of the day, go back to John Locke. John Locke's assertion is very straightforward. That every person alive on planet Earth should be able to clearly see by the light of their own reason from the design argument that God is the creator of this world and everything is God's property. And Hume says no. Again, in the way that Locke phrases this argument, in terms of straightforwardly visible, clear, accessible to all people, it's just not true. And the fact that theologians debate this to this day is not a counter-argument. Because again, you see, Locke is not Plato. He's not saying that truth is hidden beneath the layers and you need a PhD in theology and 50 years of study to prove the existence of God. This is not what Locke is saying. Locke is saying it should be clear and evident to everyone. And again, Hume, theologians will debate, but from the standpoint of international relations, Hume is right, period. Because you cannot stand up in the United Nations and say, oh, by design argument I prove the existence of God, because not everybody in the room will accept. This is not a logical disproval. This is not a logical refutation of Locke's argument. This is a political refutation of Locke's argument. Maybe Locke's argument works theologically for, if you have a PhD and again spend 50 years. But politically, this argument fails. And this is what is important for our purposes. Now, maybe I probably should not give you my opinion, but let me also mention that I'm not impressed by theological counter-arguments. But that's neither here nor there. This is a different course, which I'm not teaching to you. Okay? Anyway, so let's finally get to ethics. I should stop doing that. So in terms of ethics, Hume is some people call him an emotivist or a non-cognitivist. We have seen this already in Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes basically holds the same opinion. You remember? Whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire is that which he, for his part, calls good, and of his hate and aversion, evil. There being nothing simply and absolutely so. This is Hobbes. Hume repeats this argument verbatim. Again, the point is that if you want to postulate some kind of geometrical absolute goodness, be my guest, but nobody has been able to give us a proof, a demonstration of how this is supposed to work. So again, maybe not for the logical, but certainly for political reasons, nobody has been able to come up with proofs of, what's the right phrase, of the standard of goodness or justice derived from reason. This is unavailable to us. So the only thing that remains in the negative is that morality as it is accessible to us. Morality, in the way that it is accessible to the human mind, is human invention. And force of morality, morality has no force outside of the human will, individual will or collective will. So things are good or bad only because human beings make them good or bad. Now when I say make, by which faculty? And Hume, again, gives us an answer. By our imagination. He says moral judgment is exactly analogous to aesthetic judgment. No painting, no sculpture is beautiful or ugly in itself. Beauty or ugliness is in the eye of the beholder. It is your perception that makes you see something as beautiful and ugly. And exactly the same way, it is your perception that makes you see something as good or bad, as just or unjust. Now, more specifically, our imagination is influenced by our passions, So basically, Hume is going to say, justice is not really about ultimate supreme good, absolute goodness or absolute evil. These Platonic notions. No. Morality is about praise and blame. Praise and blame. So if I say, that's good, it means I like it. Do more of it. If I say, that's bad, it means I don't like it, please stop. That's the only thing that these words mean. And again, why do I like some things and not like other things? Do I choose to like some things and not like other things? No, says Hume. My passions are given to me. I have this body. Again, as an empiricist, I observe myself with this body that has certain needs, certain feelings, certain desires. I haven't chosen to be born in this body, okay? The fact that I need warmth or security or shelter, it's not my choice. Again, I passively observe in my mind that I need these things, otherwise I suffer. And Hume says again, ultimately, there can be no justification. Things which are pleasant, we naturally perceive as good. Our body naturally strives towards them as a matter of observation. And things which are unpleasant, we naturally recoil from. We cannot help it. Again, this is the old skeptical argument. We acquiesce in the face of appearances. This is going to be hugely important for John Stuart Mill. We'll talk about Mill next Wednesday. Mill is going to agree completely with this picture. Now, if we want to be completely pedantic, let's be completely pedantic for 1 second. Is Hume a utilitarian? Descriptively, yes. Descriptively, he's a utilitarian 100%. He says, as a matter of fact, people act in this way. This is a true description, as far as we can tell, being skeptics. As far as we can tell, this is the true description of how human beings actually act. But why is he not utilitarian 100%? Because this is not a prescription. Hume is not saying it should be this way. For Hume, there is no absolute standard of goodness or badness. This is a description, not a normative description of affairs. And does John Stuart Mill make this mistake? Well, we'll talk about this next time. At least Mill talks this way, as if it's more than just a description, it's also a prescription. It's not just a positive statement, it's also a normative statement. This, by the way, let me immediately say something. This is going to lead to a certain difference in temperament. Hume, in a very, very Hobbes-like fashion, is going to say that unless the government is really bad, although Hume is less tolerant in this respect, because you remember, for Hobbes, for government to be really bad, your life has to be in danger. Hume is not prepared to go that far. Hume is going to say, well, governments can be bad without endangering your life. And if life gets really too unpleasant, which again, Hume has a lower pain threshold. He's going to shout stop before Hobbes. Okay, Hobbes is going to wait until the worst tyranny. Hume is going to stop before that. But still, Hume says you will tolerate a pretty bad government because a pretty bad government is better than no government at all. So how should I put this? So for Hume, a bad government is better than no government, but no government is better than the worst tyranny. Okay? Something like this. For Hume. But again, to oversimplify, Hume by and large agrees with Hobbes. This is not Locke. This is almost Hobbes. Mm-hmm. And Yeah. So the difference between Hume and Mill. The difference between Hume and Mill. Mill is going to say, well, if you have a bad argument, look, we utilitarians, we have to work to reform society. We have to work to make society more just, which is more beneficial to everybody. It's our duty, says Mill, John Stuart Mill. Hume is a careful, skeptical conservative. He says, look, we are skeptics. Human mind is limited. I let go of this marker. I'm not sure if it's going to fall or not. If the government, even if it's bad, but if it's tolerable, just leave it be. Leave it be. Or if you're introducing changes, and Hume will advocate certain changes, you have to be careful. And before you introduce certain changes, you gotta think twice about the consequences. So this is a big difference in temperament between Hume and Mill. And again, which stems from the different understanding of utilitarianism. Somewhat, slightly different understanding of utilitarianism. Again, Mill in this sense is much more radical. Let me because otherwise I'll forget. Let me talk about enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, in this time in England, means religious fanaticism. Literally, an enthusiast is somebody who's infused with God. Somebody who's prophesizing like truth from God. And as you can imagine, Hume is not impressed by the enthusiasts. So people who say, so against all of this empirical skepticism, no, I have truth from God. Hume, again, according to his biographer, these were the only kinds of people who really got on his nerves. And Hume has an argument against them. He's a very careful conservative. He's against change. But these guys are live grenades. They have to be put out. Okay? This is an immediate and clear and present danger to society. And Hume is not being unrealistic when he says this. Because again, in the time of Thomas Hobbes, England went through a very tumultuous period of civil war, which in a large part was motivated by religious strife. So Hume knows, with good evidence, empirical evidence, as far as empirical evidence goes, that these people are dangerous. So again, he's not just an atheist. He's if you want, a proselytizing atheist. He thinks everybody should be an atheist, and this is going to make our life better. Now, again, does this mean you got to convert every? No. But these guys, the enthusiasts, they have to go. If you're a moderately religious person and you're not bothering anyone, be my guest. But religion, in the extreme, has to be controlled, which is true for Hobbes and for Machiavelli and for Rousseau and for many other philosophers in this course. Again, this notion that religion has to be subordinate and in the service of the state. Hegel will say the same thing. Okay, so this is the natural basis of morality. This is the natural basis of morality. What I like, I call good. What I don't like, I call evil. Okay, but what does this have to do with politics? What are rules of politics? And immediately, Hume is going to say that as a matter of empirical observation, our basic condition is a state of nature. Well, no. But Hume wants to say, in some sense, this is the natural condition of all mankind in all times and all places. But as an empiricist, he has to be careful about postulating this. So as far as he can tell, this is the universal condition of mankind, both in historical past and today. We are people of limited sociability, or limited compassion, if you want. Limited compassion. And we live in a situation of limited scarcity. And both of these are important. So Hume wants to say that, look, if I were to stand here, take off my shirt, take a surgical knife, and cut myself open in front of you, carve pieces of my own flesh and display them to you. I'm not doing harm to you, but this would not be pleasant. At least for the vast majority of you. With maybe some very interesting exceptions. And Hume says, this, again, as a matter of fact, this is how passions work. We do not like to see other people suffer. So all of us naturally do not like seeing other people suffer, and we moderately, in a limited fashion, enjoy seeing other people happy. So when other people are happy, we are happy too. We are, again, limited compassion, or if you want, limited sociability. That we are naturally social creatures. That our emotions are naturally social. Hume says at some point, a little bit echoing Aristotle, that if you isolate man from a society, he'd be very unhappy. Because all sorts of pleasures, in fact maybe most pleasures in life, say hi to Epicurus, stem from our sociability.
So, about if we see.
Yeah. So again, I care about your pains and about your pleasures. Your pleasures give me pleasure a little bit, and your pains give me pain a little bit. So I am compassionate, but not 100% compassionate. But I'm also not a completely selfish bastard. So it's a middle ground between the two. And Hume basically says that if everybody was 100% compassionate, if we were a hive mind, then politics would be unnecessary. If we were like bees, politics would be unnecessary. We would just naturally, through pheromones, do what we're supposed to. So if our compassion was not limited, but if our compassion was 100%. On the other hand, if we were completely selfish and did not care about others at all, then we would be stuck in the Hobbesian war of all against all, and no society would be possible. But Hume says, thankfully, we are in this limited situation. We are not too compassionate, but also not completely compassionless. We are not completely selfish, but also not completely selfless. Same goes for limited scarcity. We live in a world, and this was true for all times and places, even today. Although this changes in historical times a little bit, but by and large, we live in a situation of limited scarcity. So there is some scarcity, but not too much. So the idea is exactly the same. Imagine some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario. Oh yeah, when we talk about John Locke, people always love to talk about this example. We are stuck in a cave, and we have one chocolate bar. And think of John Locke, right? And you just ate the chocolate bar. Am I entitled to carve you open and take the chocolate bar from your stomach and consume it myself? Something like that. People love these kinds of examples when we talk about John Locke. And Hume is saying, if this was our situation, again, no society would be possible. If scarcity, again, deficit, if deficit was such that community would be impossible, yeah, okay, then community would be impossible. Likewise, if there was like super material abundance, imagine some kind of techno-communism of the future, or whatever, I don't know. I want to say Christian paradise, but I'm not sure how people imagine Christian paradise. Usually when people imagine Christian paradise, it sounds very boring. So, singing, praising God, enjoying looking at the torments of the damned in hell. Yeah. Say hi to Thomas Aquinas. Okay, I don't know. So anyway, so if you imagine superabundance, then again, politics would be unnecessary and people would not need one another. But both conditions are true. And this is the basis of politics. Okay, I apologize. I took too much time explaining this. I hope this is a very clear and screamingly obvious idea. So from this, Hume derives two terms. Well, he introduces two technical terms to talk about this. And these two terms are natural and artificial virtues. Natural and artificial virtues. So, natural and artificial virtues. So again, what is virtue for Hume? Virtue, if you want, is intimately related with justice for Hume. So, virtue is a meaningless word. It does not mean anything, okay? And by the way, it's also true for all philosophers. Unless you specify exactly what you mean by goodness or virtue, this word does not mean anything. Say hi to factual relativism. But this is especially true for Hume. The word virtue by itself has no meaning. The meaning of the word virtue gets supplied by our political interactions. So we call those acts virtuous, which we like. We call those acts vicious, vice virtue, which we don't like. And same goes for justice. Same goes for justice. So let's start with natural virtues. What are natural virtues? If I have a box of candy and I share it with you, you're happy. By the way, remember, also I am happy because I'm happy seeing you happy. By the way, you can try this out. Giving gifts, especially to people you like, is pleasant. Check again. Do an empirical experiment, okay? Anyway, go back a step. So if I give you a box of candy, if I share a box of candy with you, I'm happy, you're happy. This is a natural virtue. Why is it natural? Because we are naturally happy. I like it, you like it. Our nature is such that we enjoy doing this. But this is a virtue. This is a virtue in the sense that, well, okay. What is virtue? What is justice as opposed to just feeling of happiness? So again, imagine, I'm some kind of cannibal, and I enjoy eating your flesh. Is that a virtue too? No. And again, so this is a thought that's going to be crucially important for Rousseau in a moment, next lecture, and also going to be crucially important for John Stuart Mill. Virtue or justice always has to deal with the common good or common interest. Common interest. Me sharing a box of candy with you is in our common interest. And this is why we call it good. This is why we call it virtuous. It's not just me doing something for myself selfishly or me doing something at the expense of you. This is for everybody's interest. Everybody benefits. At least in a small degree. Mill's example is charity. Charity. A person gives alms in the street to a beggar. The beggar is happy, the person is happy, and everybody around looks at them and they're also happy. Common interest, justice. These are natural virtues. We naturally, and we don't have to be trained or educated. We naturally feel these feelings. But then, in addition to natural virtues, there are also artificial virtues. And artificial virtues are the things that by themselves do not elicit feelings of joy in us or pleasure. So artificial virtues, as opposed to natural virtues, by themselves are not pleasant. They become pleasant through association. Basically, society trains us the way you train dogs to like these things. So you have to be trained, educated if you want. Education is a very important notion in Hume. What would be the example of that? Let's suppose you're on a traffic intersection, and there's a traffic light, and the traffic light is red, and you stop. Okay, and let's imagine there's nobody else on the intersection. This is not pleasant to you or to maybe other people who observe this from the distance. You know, in and of itself, naturally speaking, this act is completely neutral. But if everybody does this, society benefits. So therefore, society educates, society trains us to do these things, which naturally are not good. Naturally, and in and of itself, stopping, before a red light is not pleasant, but it's good because it conduces to the social order. And basically, if you want, Hume wants to say that all of our laws, all of our rules of justice, properly speaking, are derived from these two, or at least should be derived in the ideal circumstance. I'm not sure if this is going to be helpful, but Hume also gives this example. He says that natural virtues are like building a wall. Every brick in the wall makes the wall higher. So every act of natural virtue increases everybody's happiness immediately, then and there, in the short term. But artificial virtues are like building a vault, building an arch. You understand? If I'm building a wall, every brick makes the wall higher. But if I'm building an arch, unless all the bricks are in place, the arch will fall down. Arca. Unless all the bricks are in place, the arch will fall down. So individually, one person stopping at the red light is like a brick hanging in the wall. It falls down. It's not doing anything. It's not doing any good. Only if we have the social convention, traffic laws, and if everybody observes it, only then this is good, beneficial, makes us happy, makes everybody happy. Does this make sense? Now Hume says that, and by the way, this is so anthropologically true, what Hume says. So that in the beginning, and Hume was, among other things, an historian, thinks that in the beginning, human beings lived in small societies. And in small societies, you don't really need any government. You know everybody, and everybody knows you. And human beings, through some process or another, evolve these rules of justice, these artificial virtues, invent certain conventions which are defined as artificial virtues. And if in a small society of, let's say, a small village of 50 individuals, if you break artificial virtues, if you break artificial rules of justice, everybody can observe and everybody can punish you, and the effects are clear, the effects are seen. But Hume says, in a large society, simply public opinion is not enough. Like, let's imagine paying taxes. Is that natural or artificial? Hume says clearly, when you sort of sign out these forms, and especially today, this whole cashless economy, you do this through a credit card, nobody is immediately happy because you pay your taxes. But in a well-functioning society, we need to pay taxes for the long-term interest of everybody. Long-term rational self-interest. Let me write this on the board. Long-term rational self-interest. Long-term rational self-interest. If one person evades taxes, this is not going to lead to the collapse of the society. Again, if you live in a village of 50 people, everybody knows who has paid the taxes and who has not paid taxes. You can count. It's very simple. But in a society of several hundred million, one person evades taxes, and this seems to have no effect. But the trouble is, free rider problem from games theory. If everybody does this, society collapses. Which is why, says Hume, David Hume, we need a government. Because, again, human beings have short-sighted, selfish, immediate interests, and then also everybody has a long-term rational self-interest. And the government needs to align the two. So, short-sighted. And notice, and Rousseau is going to repeat this. Justice and utility are together. They are the same thing. Justice and utility are the same. If everybody stops paying taxes, we're all screwed. It's bad for everybody. We need to pay taxes. It's good for the society. But there's an incentive to not pay taxes, which is why government needs to provide punishments, but also rewards, I guess, but mostly punishments, but maybe also rewards, I don't know, to make sure that the immediate self-interest and the long-term self-interest align. So it's like, you're on a diet, and there's a chocolate cake in the fridge, and you ask your roommate or your mom, I don't know, to hide the chocolate cake from you. Because you know that against your better judgment, against your long-term rational self-interest, you will short-sightedly eat the cake and then regret it 15 minutes later. This is the role of the government, to align the long-term and the short-term. And again, Hume says that, again, strictly speaking, government, legitimate government, exists for the benefit of the people. Same as for Locke, same as for Hobbes. Legitimate government is based on the interests, on the commonality of interests of the government. And Hume wants to say that in the ideal situation, if you can make the government by consent, if you can make the government through a contract, this would be wonderful. This would be perfect, excellent. If you can make an explicit agreement and have some kind of a democratic government. But Hume says that, as a matter of fact, it's unrealistic to ask for consent. Like, most societies do not have this kind of explicit agreement at their core. And it is impossible and impractical to demand such a thing. So Hume is a critic of the social contract theory. So Hume will write against the social contract. Why? Because Hume says, if you believe the social contract theory, and if you decide that since I haven't signed the contract, I don't know, the government is not treating me very well, let's say I want to renegotiate the terms of the agreement, or maybe let's say I want to break off the rules of the agreement. Everybody will suffer. Again, you see, Hume is a skeptic. Human mind is limited. Human beings will be tempted to break the social contract even in times when this is actually not beneficial, and will lead to long-term chaos. And Hume says, ultimately, again, social contract does no work. And two technical reasons, maybe, to talk about this. So I said this, social contract does no work. Social contract performs no function. I mean, it could, but in general, it doesn't. And Locke gives two kinds of arguments. So first of all, he talks about Locke's tacit consent. And you remember, Locke says, if you inherit property from your parents, or if you freely travel on a highway and you are protected by the laws, you tacitly consent, says Locke. And Hume says, that's ridiculous. In order for something to really be consent, you got to be aware that you are consenting. And you have to be able to withdraw your consent. So you have to be aware, and you have to be able to withdraw your consent. But Hume says both of these circumstances are patently not true, empirically speaking, not true. Most people don't think about this in such terms. They didn't think about it in Hobbes's time, in Hume's time. Most people don't think about it this way, at our time. So most people are unaware that when they inherit the property, they're actually signing some kind of implicit agreement. This is point number one. But point number two, Hume says, look, I am a shoemaker or a thatcher or somebody. I only have enough money to maybe survive, through the month, or maybe a couple months ahead, if I'm really lucky. I do not know the languages of foreign countries. I do not know the customs of the foreign countries. Can I really move out? Is it really my free choice to continue staying in England? And Hume says, no. It's as if I was asleep, and you abducted me, you kidnapped me, and placed me on a ship. And the ship is in the middle of the ocean. And you say, look, now you are supposed to tacitly consent to the captain, or feel free to leave if you don't like it. Leave where? Drown in the sea? Thank you very much. That's an excellent choice, says David Hume. So this is not really. He says that as a matter of fact, societies are not really based on anything which can be properly called social contract. But the second thing that Hume is going to say is maybe even more powerful. Hume says, what is a social contract? Social contract is a promise. How do you know that I will keep my promise? Well, it seems that for people like Hobbes and for people like Locke, at least to some extent, although this is an interesting technical point, can Hobbes respond to this? Anyway, let me go back to my example. So, how do you know that I will keep my promise? Well, for Hobbes, again, at least nominally, you keep promises only in security. You keep promises only after you have signed the social contract. You keep the promises only as a function of the social contract. The social contract is the basis for all promises. But Hume jumps in and says, but that's circular. You promise to keep the promises? So it's like, I promise to keep my word, that I will 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 keep my up until infinity. This is called an infinite regress. This is a circular argument. Okay, let me go over this once again. So, the social contract is a promise. Between citizens and the government. A certain, yeah. So, government promises this, citizens promise this. For Hobbes, not exactly, but whatever. The question is, why do you keep the promise? Because you promised to keep the promise? And why do you want to keep the promise that you promised to keep the promise? Because you promised that it's circular. Doesn't work. So basically Hume is saying that for you to keep your promise, there needs to be some extraneous reason to keep the promise. And Hume says we have this reason, and this reason is common interest. So, conclusion. Government is not based on the social contract. Government is based on the common interest. The social contract does no work. Basically, Hume is going to say that the only way that the social contract can work is if you assume that people have common interest. But if you assume that people have common interest, you don't need any social contract. See, again, he has this example. Two people stuck, maybe, let's say, the ship has sunk, and two people are stuck in a boat in the middle of the ocean. And they row towards land. Hume asks, do they need to have a promise, a contract, formal contract, or explicit or tacit contract between them to say, I will row as long as you continue rowing? No! They both want to get to shore. Their desire, their passion animates them. Desire to get to shore. Likewise, our desire to stay safe, to earn money, to, whatever, enjoy things in life, this is what motivates us in this life, in this society. And all of this social contract stuff is just, again, Hume thinks this is dangerous talk. Because if really people get this idea about social contracts, they will start thinking about revolutions where revolutions are uncalled for. Again, in this sense, Hume represents maybe a more sober, more pedestrian, version of Hume's argument. That do you sign a social contract? Every second of your life you ask, is it better for me to stay in society or go outside society? And most of the time, Hume thinks you will, as long as society is in your interest, you will obey the government. Now, if the government becomes tyrannical, steals your property, kills your children, you break the agreement. And your passions decide that. Something along those lines. Let me mention reciprocity, because that's an important point. I keep walking around. We'll talk about this more next time when we talk about John Stuart Mill. Reciprocity. By the way, remind me if I forget. I need to talk about Cleonexia, okay? This wonderful word I keep using every class. Let's talk about Cleonexia in a second. But let me finish with reciprocity first. For Hobbes, and for Hume, and for John Stuart Mill, and for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and for Immanuel Kant, and for so many others, reciprocity will always be somewhere among the key rules of justice. When I say reciprocity, by the way, usually this implies equality. Equality of some kind. So maybe we have real inequality in society, like some people, let's say economic inequality. Some people, as a matter of fact, own more than others. But still, it's important that the rules of property are the same for everybody, and we have the same, opportunity or the same starting conditions. Everybody has the same starting condition. Or, let's say, some people, by virtue of, excellent grades on the exam, will be appointed to positions of power, but the exams are open to all. So at the basis of justice, there's this basic idea of equality. And the question is why? Why? And thinkers usually gloss over this point. They don't really go deeper into it. So let's try to wrap our head around this. So again, we are talking about reciprocity and equality for all these guys usually only when we talk about a political body, a particular political society. We are usually not talking about all people all over the world, because reciprocity is possible, again, if you think about David Hume within common interest, and common interest is usually linked to some limited, small body of men. So let's imagine your society. And you have a bunch of people, right? And I'm doing something, and I claim that it is good. How can I come out and claim that it is good for people like Hume or Mill or Rousseau? I can claim that it is good only to the extent that it benefits everyone. At least in some respect. If there are people who are excluded from this, let's say redheads, or people with blue eyes, I benefit everybody except for people with blue eyes. These people then, properly speaking, are not part of society. My argument that what I'm doing is good does not work for them. Again, if I share a box of chocolates, but maliciously, I only share with this part of the room and not this part of the room. This part of the room, you guys are going to be upset. So as soon as I do this, as soon as I share only with some, you're saying, this is not a good thing that I do. I do this maybe selfishly because I want to ingratiate myself with you. We are a faction of our own. We are no longer a society. So you see, again, most philosophers will not discuss this explicitly. But equality, in a logical sense, or at least equality of some kind, has to be somewhere in there, in the calculation. Again, it's a good question for utilitarians. Why does the utility of everybody count as the same? Because if it doesn't, it's not really about justice anymore. Because if I say only the utility of people with blue eyes count and everybody else does not count, then properly speaking, these other guys are no longer part of my society. And I'm not talking to these guys, and my arguments will fall flat on their ears. So, is this an argument against aristocracy? To some extent, yes. The only kind of aristocracy that's going to be permissible by these kinds of rules is if we have equality, all equal opportunity to become aristocrats. Like aristocracy not of birth, but aristocracy of merit. And notice, again, usually when we talk about aristocracy of merit, the idea is that, yes, you allow the ablest people to take positions of power in society because this is good for all. And this is, properly speaking, justice. Something like that. Okay, that's a complicated point, but, we'll keep returning to it. Next time, Kant will have something to say about this as well. Let me talk about Cleonexia. Now, you probably can see that Hume has these interesting assumptions about human nature. he sets human nature in such a way that we are predisposed towards social order. Chaos is possible. And by the way, so if we have limited compassion, why is it that you have genocides and slaughters? And Hume will always say bad education. That naturally speaking, genocides will not occur. It's, again, the 30 Years' War happens because of bad education, because of enthusiasm. Quarter of the European population dies because of these false and stupid ideas about, or at least unsubstantiated ideas about God and salvation. So basically, Hume has a certain view of human nature. And Hume is going to say that at the end of the day, even if the government is not perfectly enforcing, because remember, the government is there to align your long-term rational interest with your short-term selfish interest. Hume is going to say that even if at the end of the day the government is not doing its job properly, you still should obey the law. Because, says Hume, if you disobey, what you get are, and he has this beautiful phrase, he says, worthless toys. Does this remind you of anybody? We talked about this before, right? So injustice can only get you worthless toys. But if you obey the law, you'll have a clear conscience and peace and tranquility for the rest of your life. Does this remind you of anybody in this course before?
Some sophists.
How about Epicurus? So he says, if you rebel against such precious maxims and do evil things, villainous things, you will acquire only worthless toys and I'm not sure how to read this one. Geekos, whatever. But if you obey the rules of justice, you will have inward peace of mind and consciousness of integrity. Again, there is this, again, so Cleonexia, in some sense, Hume wants to oppose ataraxia to pleonexia. These are not the words he uses, okay? But these are the words I use a lot in this course. It says that peace of mind, tranquility, is more valuable, is more in your long-term self-interest than trying to acquire more and more and more and more and more. And interesting issue. But what if you have some people who are by nature pleonexic? Because remember, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Let's suppose, and psychologists tell me, for what it's worth, it may be true, that a certain portion of the population are genetically psychopaths today. And they will take advantage of society in all sorts of ways. It's interesting contemporary scientific psychological research into this question. Well, Hume wants to say that, again, in a certain, what do you do with these people? Again, there is no absolute standard of justice or morality. But they are damaging society, so we punish them. But notice, we punish maniacs and psychopaths and all the rest of them not as moral. Sorry, not as immoral, not as immoral. And not as irrational. Not immoral and not irrational. Because again, if you're a psychopath and you enjoy the splashing of warm blood on your cheeks, that's just the way your passions work. So you punish them not as immoral and not as irrational. You punish them as inhuman. Why? Because it is in our common interest to punish these transgressions. Yes, at bottom, Hume is going to say, we do not have absolute justice with a capital J. And when we punish criminals, sometimes we will punish them in some sense for our own selfish desires, but collective selfish desires. And that's okay. Because our passions will lead us to do that. Again, this picture does not absolve people from responsibility. In fact, and notice, Hume, in this sense, we keep talking about this free will. Hume, very importantly, is a compatibilist. He thinks that freedom and determinism are possible at the same time. So again, this is a deterministic picture. The mind is a deterministic calculator, and passions are simply given to you. So determinism. So again, it was written in the book of history 13.7 billion years ago that I will raise my right arm and not my left arm. Likewise, it was written in the book of history that, Ted Bundy is going to carve all those people to shreds in the book of history. So in a certain metaphysical sense, it's not his fault. But it doesn't matter. because again, Hume says to be free, can you be free? Yes, not from the laws of physics, but to be free is to be predetermined by the right kinds of causes. To be free is to be predetermined by the right kinds of causes, basically by your internal psychological mechanisms. And notice, says Hume, this does not detract from our penal justice. This is the only thing that sustains our penal justice. Only because people are unfree, prisons and laws can work. Only because human beings have deterministic passions and criminals are determined to not like being in prison or not like, being guillotined or something like that. Only because of that you can affect the conduct of the person's behavior. The same way you train your dog in a certain similar fashion, mechanistically, deterministically, we train criminals to not commit crimes. If you have different passions from ours, we will create a system of incentives which will disincentivize crime. But again, if criminals were perfectly free, like Immanuel Kant imagines them to be, in principle, criminal justice would have no effect on crimes. If crimes are committed freely, you cannot deter crimes by penal laws. You can only deter crimes if criminals are calculating machines, mechanistically, deterministically arriving at a certain conclusion. Hume at the end of the day is unapologetic about this. Yes. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. The only justification I need to place a murderer or a maniac behind bars is because it is unpleasant, abhorrent, unbearable from the standpoint of my passions emotionally for me to live in a society with such people. And this could potentially be a problem for Hume, except that, again, he relies on a certain notion of common human nature, and he understands that most people are not like that. Again, as long as, and this is similar to some of the things we talked about before, as long as most people are not psychopaths, it's fine. You don't really need to go into all these issues. So it's very interesting how Hume has this very skeptical bent of mind, very radical, very skeptical. Again, he's the champion of the radical skepticism. But at the end of the day, his conclusions mostly leave everything in place. And he says, yes, when I drop the marker, I don't know if it's going to fall or not. But honestly, again, my passions, as he says, carelessness and inattention will save me from the skeptical doubts. That if you really try to be skeptical, again, this question, how do I know if a speeding bus rushing towards me will kill me or not? How do I know? Hume says, you don't need to make this decision. Your body makes the decision for you. Again, while, in a classroom like this, we can talk about the skepticism, suspension of judgment. Who knows? Maybe all of this is a matrix, or some kind of evil demon, or computer simulation, or whatever. But Hume says, as long as you walk out of this room, your body takes over. You want to have a cup of coffee, you chat with your friends, play a game of cards. You have different barbarian games these days, but some like that. And Hume says again, it is impossible for us to be really stuck in this skeptical trap. He says, if passions were not strong, then skepticism would be a problem. We'd be terrified and stuck in our tracks. But fortunately, Hume says, nature is too strong for principle. Nature is too strong for principle, meaning that our passions are stronger than our reason. And so again, we will forget about all these skeptical doubts and just live the way we lived before, stopping at the red lights and obeying the law, and everything is going to be fine, mostly. Especially if you assume that ataraxia is better than Cleonexia. Okay. And that's the story. Did I miss anything? Do I want to add anything of importance? Well, we'll clear this up in the seminar. By the way, those of you expecting an excellent grade, please try to read the full text of Klosko. I've also uploaded Bausch and Kelly this morning. I'll delete it because it's too technical. Okay, I wish I could take your questions, but unfortunately, lamentably, we're out of time. So I hope this was fun. Sedate Hume, love him, read him. And again, if you have any questions, ask me maybe during the break. Otherwise, I'll see you in 20 minutes and we will talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau.